I can understand that the American public had become war weary, and both sides of politics had indicated that. I guess my criticism, my reservation about the way it's been handled is, was it absolutely essential to withdraw every last soldier by a given date? I don't think that was necessary. There was no reason why a very much smaller force could not have been left there for an indeterminate time, and that would have prevented some of the negative images that have clearly come out of Afghanistan and could well have emboldened the Afghan army, provided it had been supplemented by some air cover to have provided more resistance to the Taliban. I don't think it was absolutely essential to withdraw every last soldier. That's the criticism, observation I would make.
So essentially to help the Afghan National Army gradually step up more and more, as opposed to a deadline, a date that the Taliban could work to as well.
I thought it was an error of the former President Donald Trump to effectively say, we're getting out, now let's sit down and talk about whether we can reach an agreement about what happens after we've gone. That was a mistake. He gave away his negotiating coin in doing that. And I think once the date had taken over and the date was driving the behaviour, instead of the behaviour resulting in a final outcome, it was almost unavoidable that we were going to see what actually happened, and the speed with which it occurred and the way in which it occurred against all predictions made by the Americans demonstrated that.
Have you spoken to your friend George W. Bush since the fall of Kabul? What's his view of the capitulation?
No, the answer is I haven't. No, I haven't. I'm not aware of any statements he's made about it. That's a matter for him. But the situation is that the original commitment was totally justified, and I don't think Australia has made any errors in the involvement that we've had in Afghanistan. We were right to go in 20 years ago. We were right back in 2005 to send some special forces back because there had been evidence of a resurgence of the Taliban and also in a small way of Al-Qaeda. And I think we have done better things in Afghanistan because of our presence than the Americans and other countries have been given credit for. There are a lot more young people being educated. There are a lot more rights being enjoyed by women and girls. Now, we're concerned that they might be whittled away by the Taliban, and that is obviously very much in everybody's mind at the present moment.
Was there a damaging distraction with the Iraq war? I know there was broad support for the initial deployment to Afghanistan. There was essentially across the board support for that intervention, not as much Iraq. In hindsight, do you see that as a damaging distraction from the Afghanistan effort?
No, I don't accept that. That argument's been advanced by a lot of people. Look, there were different views in Australia about whether we should have gone into Iraq. The opposition in Australia was very strongly opposed to the Iraqi campaign, whereas the opposition had supported our intervention in Afghanistan. But the initial objective of getting rid of Al-Qaeda, of destroying the capacity of the Taliban to provide a sanctuary for a future attack out of Afghanistan, ultimately the tracking down and the assassination of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, all of those things, as it were objectives, and they were achieved and fully realised. But in 2005, there was evidence that the Taliban was resurgent in areas, and Al-Qaeda as well, and it was in consequence of that we sent some forces back. But I don't think our capacity to do that was compromised by what we did in Iraq.
You don't think that it reduced, I guess, the US supremacy both in a military sense but a moral one as well?
Well, that assumes that what America did in relation to Iraq was not justified. I thought it was. That's why the government I led at the time supported it. So my answer to that is no.
Now, Australia is doing its best to repatriate not just our citizens, but those that worked alongside Australian forces and other officials there. Do you see why many of our ADF veterans are so keen for us to be generous here? And do you think the government's got more room to lift that 3,000 number of humanitarian places, particularly when you look at the UK, for example, with 25,000 committed refugee spots?
Well, we've already said we're going to take a certain number in addition to the special visas we're giving for people who work very closely with our people in Afghanistan. I understand the concern of our veterans. It's a concern I have. And I've said something about this several weeks ago. I didn't want to see anything remotely resembling the disgraceful way that the then Australian government treated people who'd worked with us in Vietnam way back in the 1970s. And that obviously hasn't happened because on this occasion, this government is doing everything it can to pull people out. Now, it's a very difficult and dangerous operation because the Taliban is clearly making it hard for people to get to the airport, and everybody is aware from the quite horrific scenes of chaos at the airport, of what panic there is, what concern there is. And fortunately, the Americans have sent back some troops, the British have sent troops in order to maintain a semblance of order at the airport. But that's still very much a work in progress. And it's very easy for countries to nominate a target when it comes to refugees, and I'm not in any way criticising the Brits or the others, but in the end, what matters is who you actually take and how many, and I am confident that the government, our government, will do everything it humanly can, given the difficult circumstances, to extricate as many people as possible. But it's obviously a very difficult and dangerous operation.
Now, finally, we're facing a crisis of our own at the moment, this ongoing pandemic. Governments and the federal government have set targets of 70, 80% vaccination for easing of restrictions. Mr. Howard, how important is it in your mind to give Australians clarity on the way out, on the roadmap and the way to get out of these things?
Well, I think clarity is always important when you're planning the future, but it's a question of how much clarity anybody can give. I think what all the governments have plainly agreed to, is my understanding, that once we get to 70%, we can have fewer restrictions. Once we get to 80%, we can have even fewer restrictions. Now, I think that's quite clear. It's inevitable you'll get different statements made by state premiers, and what we're seeing at the moment is state governments exercising powers they've always had, but they've never exercised in the past because in our lifetime we haven't had anything like this. I think one of the things that surprises me is that people think that there are certain things the federal government can do when they can't. The federal government doesn't run public hospitals. The federal government can't give public health orders. The police are answerable to the state governments. And what we're seeing is the operation of our federal system, which in a way that's always been there, but it's never been like that before because we haven't had anything like this before. You have to go back to the Spanish flu, which is 100 years ago. And of course, that came in the wake of the terrible losses of World War I. It was a world away from what we have now.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, been going through a difficult time in a political sense. Have you got any advice that you would offer him to get through this period?
Well, we talk fairly regularly, and any advice I offer him is obviously private. The only public comment is, I think he's made it very clear that everybody should get vaccinated, and the sooner that happens, the sooner we can reach these targets. And the sooner we reach these targets, the sooner we'll be in a situation where lockdowns either end or become far less likely. Now, isn't that what everybody wants? And I think he's made that very clear. And I think all the forces of the federal government, and I hope all the forces of state governments, would be directed towards that end. And this is not an occasion for any kind of parochialism or states' rights bravado. We don't want any of that. We just want to get people vaccinated. We want to save lives. And we've got to remember that our country has been unbelievably successful. If the measurement of success is saving human life, we have been so successful. So successful.
Former Prime Minister John Howard, as always, I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Kieran.